The day Pauline Brenner rode into Harding Creek, New Mexico, in the spring of 1882, she did so with a Winchester rifle across her saddle, a split lip she hadn't bothered to tend, and eyes that had long since learned to stop searching the horizon for anything good. The town was modest by any measure. A single main street flanked by a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon with a crooked sign that read Beaumont's, a small church that needed a coat of whitewash, and a sheriff's office that looked as though it had been built by someone who had never intended to stay. Dust moved through the street in slow, lazy spirals, and a pair of dogs lifted their heads when her horse clipped along the packed earth, then decided she was no particular threat and went back to sleeping. Pauline was 26 years old. She did not look it. She looked like someone who had lived twice that inexperience, and only half of it had been kind. She tied her roan mare, a creature she called Gable, for no reason she ever explained to anyone, at the post outside the general store and went inside. She needed flour, salt pork, and something to put on her lip before it got worse. She also needed to find out if the word she'd received in Tucson 3 weeks ago was still good, that a woman named Martha Delacroix was hiring on a housekeeper and a second set of hands at her cattle ranch outside of Harding Creek, and that Martha was the sort of woman who didn't ask too many questions. The general store smelled of beeswax and dried herbs and sawdust. A heavy-set man with a pleasantly red face stood behind the counter and gave her a wide, genuine smile. "Afternoon, miss. Just passing through or looking to stay?" "Depends," Pauline said, setting her leather saddlebag on the counter. "I'm looking for Martha Delacroix's ranch. I heard she had work." The man's smile softened into something almost sympathetic. "You heard right, though I'd call it more of a cattle holding than a ranch these days. Martha lost her husband Tom 2 winters back. She's been keeping things together mostly through sheer cussedness, if you'll forgive the expression." He extended his hand. "Harlan Webb. I run this store and try to know everything that goes on in this town. Successfully, I might add." Pauline shook it. "Pauline Brenner." "Well, Miss Brenner, the Delacroix place is about 4 miles northeast. Follow the creek until you see a red barn with a weather vane shaped like a running horse. You can't miss it." He glanced at her lip, then politely at the shelf behind her head. "I've got some salve that'll help with that. No charge." Pauline reached into her coin purse. "I pay for what I use." Harlan nodded and asked no further questions, which immediately made her like him. She bought her flour, her salt pork, and the salve, and she was turning to go when the door swung open and a man stepped in, nearly filling the frame with his shoulders. He pulled his hat off, a battered thing that had once been black and was now somewhere between gray and brown, and ran a hand through dark hair that needed a cut. He was perhaps 30, with a jaw that hadn't met a razor in 4 days and eyes the color of creek water in summer, a kind of clear green-brown that shifted with whatever light was near. He was lean but built in the way of men who actually worked rather than men who merely looked like they did. A deputy's badge caught the afternoon light on his chest. He didn't see Pauline at first. He was already talking to Harlan. "Harlan, you ordered those fence staples yet? Judge Alderman says if the gap on the north side of the county road isn't mended by—" Then he saw her. He stopped talking. Not in a rude way, not in the way men sometimes stopped when they were looking at a woman for the wrong reasons, but in the way of someone who had registered something unexpected and was giving it a moment's proper attention. His eyes went to her face, to the lip, and then, and this was the thing that Pauline noticed, the thing that set him slightly apart from other men, he looked at her eyes instead, as if that was the more important information. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," Pauline said, and picked up her saddlebag. "Ira Carson," Harlan said cheerfully, as if introductions were his personal gift to the world. "Our deputy." "Ira, this is Pauline Brenner. She's heading out to Martha Delacroix's place about some work." Ira Carson gave her a nod, not the up-and-down kind, just a single, straight nod, the kind that said he registered her as a full human being. "Martha's a good woman," he said. "You'll be in good company." "I'll take your word for it," Pauline said and walked out. She felt his eyes on her back for 2 or 3 seconds, and then she heard him resume his conversation with Harlan about fence staples. And she told herself that was exactly right. That was exactly how it should go. And she climbed up onto Gable and rode northeast along the creek. Martha Delacroix was 61, sharp as a tack, and had a laugh like a mule's bray that she was completely unashamed of. She had a wide face full of lines that spoke more of sun and laughter than of grief, though the grief was there too if you looked. She came out onto the porch when Pauline rode up, wiped her hands on her apron and looked her over for a long, silent moment. "You're tougher than the last one they sent me," Martha said finally. "I don't know who sent you the last one," Pauline replied. "Nobody sent you. I came on my own word." Martha's weathered face broke into a grin. "Even better, get down off that horse and come inside. I've got coffee on and a room that needs occupying." The room was small, with a rope bed and a window that looked out over the east pasture, where a dozen or so longhorns grazed in the late afternoon gold. Pauline set her bag down and stood at the window for a long time, listening to the absolute quiet of the place, the wind, and the distant low of cattle and nothing else, and something in her chest that had been pulled very tight for a very long time released the smallest, most cautious degree. She had been in worse places. She had been in places that made this one look like paradise. She was going to be careful not to love it too quickly. Martha's arrangement was straightforward room and board, and a modest wage for help with the cooking, cleaning, and whatever was needed with the cattle and the fence lines, and the general relentless labor of keeping a small ranch alive. Martha had one hired hand, an older Mexican cowboy named Paco who had worked the place for 9 years and treated Martha with the courtly devotion of a man who has given his loyalty completely and found it well placed. He tipped his hat to Pauline on her first morning, called her Miss Brenner, and handed her a cup of coffee without being asked, and Pauline decided he was one of the decent ones. She settled into the work with the focused efficiency of someone who has learned to find safety in usefulness. She rose before dawn, got the stove going, made breakfast, and by the time the sun was properly up, she was already out checking water troughs or mending a gate or helping Paco with whatever needed doing. Martha watched her the first week with a kind of quiet assessment, and by the end of it stopped watching because she had made up her mind. "You've done this kind of work before," Martha said one evening over supper. "I've done most kinds of work," Pauline said. Martha looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. "I'm not going to ask where you come from, Pauline. That's your business, but I want you to know this is a safe place, whatever that means to you." Pauline looked down at her plate. Her throat tightened in the specific way it did when someone was unexpectedly kind. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in more layers than Martha probably knew. The first time Ira Carson rode out to the Delacroix ranch after Pauline's arrival, it was on legitimate business. One of Martha's longhorns had apparently wandered through a broken section of fence onto the road and nearly caused a wagon accident, and Sheriff Dooley had sent Ira out to log the fence damage and inform Martha officially so she could make repairs. He arrived on a big gray horse named Biscuit. Pauline would learn the horse's name later and find it endlessly incongruous. And Martha came out to meet him with Pauline a half step behind, since they had been in the middle of patching a section of the chicken yard fence when they heard hooves. Ira Carson tipped his hat to Martha, said his official piece about the wandering longhorn with the precise, careful language of a man who doesn't want to make a neighbor feel accused of anything, and then his eyes found Pauline over Martha's shoulder. "Miss Brenner," he said, "settling in all right." "Well enough," she said. There was a pause, very brief, in which neither of them said anything further. Martha glanced between them with the radar of a woman who has been alive for 61 years and has noted every variety of human moment. "Ira, stay for supper," Martha said. "It's the least I can do after old Rojo got out and nearly ruined someone's afternoon. I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. Pauline made a beef stew that is going to make you wish you'd proposed to someone who could cook." Ira looked like he might politely refuse, and then something shifted, something small and deliberate, and he said, "I'd be grateful. Thank you, Martha." Supper was at the big pine table in Martha's kitchen, with Paco joining them as he always did, and the conversation moved easily through the comfortable channels of ranch business, town news, the spring weather, and whether the new circuit preacher was as good as the last one or only thought he was. Ira Carson, Pauline observed, spoke with the unhurried precision of a man who chose his words because they mattered to him, not because he was performing. He was funny in a dry way that crept up on you. He asked Paco about his opinion on the fence situation with genuine interest, and listened to the answer. He did not, as many men did, treat Martha's table as a place to hold court. And twice, when there was a lull, he glanced at Pauline, not the long, weighing glance of assessment, but the quick, almost involuntary kind that happens when a person keeps thinking about someone and their eyes confirm what their mind is already doing. Pauline had been looked at in every way a woman can be looked at, and she had catalogued all of them and learned what they meant. This one was new. Or rather, it was old, the oldest and most honest kind, the kind she had not had the luxury of receiving in a very long time. She looked away both times. After supper, Ira helped carry the plates to the basin without being asked, and Martha said, "Now you see." "This is why I like you, Ira Carson," and Ira said, "It's just plates, Martha," and Martha said, "Exactly." He rode back to town in the blue dark of early evening, and Pauline stood on the porch and watched him go, and told herself firmly that she was only watching to make sure the gate had latched behind him. The gate had latched. She watched anyway. Over the following weeks, the rhythms of the Delacroix ranch became familiar to Pauline in the way that places you unexpectedly love become familiar, not just known but felt. She knew exactly how the morning light came through her east window and turned the dust motes into gold. She knew that the second board on the porch steps creaked, and that the old mother hen in the chicken yard would let Pauline pick her up without a fuss but would chase Paco halfway across the yard. She knew that Martha said her prayers out loud before bed, not loudly, but audibly, and that she always added something at the end that sounded like a name, Tom, Pauline assumed, though she never asked. She also knew that Ira Carson rode out to check on things about once a week, sometimes with a legitimate reason and sometimes without one, and that his visits had gradually extended from brief and official to longer and easy, the way a man's visits do when he has stopped pretending they are only about the business at hand. He would sit on the porch with Martha and Pauline after supper, and they would talk, or sometimes they wouldn't talk much at all, and that was fine too. He told them about the town, its small dramas and larger concerns. He told them about a dispute over water rights between two ranchers that had been simmering since the previous fall, and that he was trying to mediate before Sheriff Dooley, who had a temper where property was concerned, made things worse. He told them about a family that had come through on their way to California and lost a wheel on their wagon, and how half the town had turned out to help fix it, because that was the thing about small places, the basic decency of people who had to depend on each other. He asked Pauline questions, two careful ones, nothing that pushed, just the kind that opened a door and waited to see if she came through it. What she thought of the spring weather so far. Whether she'd had any trouble with the North Pasture Gate. Whether she had ridden much before coming to New Mexico. She answered what she answered and left the rest, and he accepted this without any change in his expression, without the flickering impatience or the slightly wounded look that men sometimes wore when a woman did not offer herself up on demand. He simply moved on to the next thing, easy and unhurried. One evening in late May, he arrived to find Pauline alone on the porch, Martha having gone to lie down early with a headache and Paco having ridden into town to visit his sister. Ira sat down in the chair across from her with a naturalness that suggested he wasn't going to make anything of them being alone, and Pauline respected that, though she was also acutely aware of the space between them and how the evening light lay across his face and turned the green in his eyes very green. "Heard you helped old Sam Kirby get his barn roof patched last week," Ira said, settling his hat on his knee. "He needed an extra pair of hands. He's 80 years old and stubborn as a post. Most people don't bother offering." "I offered," Pauline said. Ira looked at her with that quiet, straight look he had, the one that felt like being read without being judged. "Where'd you come from, Pauline, if you don't mind my asking?" "Kansas originally," she said, "then some other places." "Kansas," he said as if he was placing it in his mind. "I grew up in Texas, small town called Cottonwood Fork that isn't there anymore. They moved the railroad and the town sort of followed it somewhere else. My parents had a place there. I came up here after." He paused for a moment. "After some things." She glanced at him. "After some things." He gave a small, rueful smile. "I suppose we all have those." "We do," she said. The silence that fell between them then was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have both recognized that they are carrying weight and that they are, for the moment, not required to put it down or discuss it, only to sit in the same evening air. Pauline looked out at the east pasture, where the longhorns were dark silhouettes against the orange sky, and she thought, "I could tell him. Not now, not yet. But I think I could tell him." The thought frightened her badly enough that she stood up and said she had bread in the oven, which was true, and went inside. It was a Saturday in early June when things shifted. There was a small celebration in Harding Creek, the dedication of a new water pump at the town square, which was a practical matter but one the townspeople had decided to dress up with bunting and a fiddle player and a general excuse to gather. Martha decided they were all going, including Paco, who put on a clean shirt and combed his silver hair with great seriousness. The town was livelier than Pauline had yet seen it. Women in their good dresses, men in their least dirty hats, children running in the dust, and Harlan Webb presiding over a table of pies and cornbread with the benevolent energy of a man in his natural element. The fiddle player, a tiny woman of approximately 70 with flying white hair, played with terrifying ferocity, and couples moved through the open square in something that was not quite a dance but was clearly trying to be. Pauline stood with Martha and watched, and drank lemonade, and tried not to feel the thing that she sometimes felt in crowds: the edge, the hyper-awareness, the old habit of marking every exit and noting every man whose eyes stayed on her too long. She mostly succeeded. Ira found her when she had drifted to the quieter side of the square, near the church wall, where the sound of the fiddle was manageable. He appeared at her elbow without announcement, holding 2 cups of lemonade, one of which he offered her. She had just emptied her first cup, and she accepted the second with a look that said she noticed the timing. "Were you watching to see when I'd run out?" she asked. "I was watching," he said simply, and the honesty of it was so uncalculated that she didn't know what to do with it for a moment. "There's a man against the saloon wall," she said, instead of addressing what he'd said. "He's been looking at me since we arrived." Ira turned his head unhurried and looked. "That's Ed Faber," he said. "He's harmless. He looks at most women that way, and most women have made it clear they find it tedious." He looked back at her. "If he bothers you, you tell me." "I handle things myself," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I just meant that you don't have to." She took a drink of lemonade and felt something complicated move through her, not quite gratitude, not quite resistance, something in between them that she didn't have a word for yet. They stood together for a while without talking, watching the dancing, and then Ira said, "Do you dance, Pauline?" "I used to," she said, "a long time ago." "Would you want to again?" She considered this. She was very aware of her own heartbeat, which was making more noise than it had any business making. "Not tonight," she said, "but I don't think the answer is never." He accepted this with the same quiet grace with which he accepted everything she gave him and everything she didn't. "That's good to know," he said. When the evening wound down and the fiddle player finally surrendered to her own exhaustion, Ira walked Pauline to where Gable was tied, not intrusively, just walking the same direction, and when she was up in the saddle he looked up at her and said, I'm glad you came to Harding Creek, Pauline Brenner. She looked down at him in the last of the lantern light, his hat pushed back on his head, and his face open in a way that some part of her wanted very much to trust. We'll see, she said, and rode back to the ranch with Martha and Paco, and told herself the warmth in her chest was the lemonade. She knew it wasn't. What happened in the third week of June was not dramatic in its mechanics, but was large in its consequence. A letter arrived for Pauline, brought out by Harlan Webb himself on a supply run, and Harlan being Harlan handed it over without a word, and watched the color leave her face with the gentle concern of a man who knows when to ask nothing. She took the letter to her room and sat on the edge of her rope bed and held it for a long time before she opened it. It was from a woman named Ruth in Abilene, Kansas, the closest thing Pauline had to a friend from her former life, and Ruth's handwriting was careful and labored, and the news it carried was that a man named Clement Foss had been released from the Dodge City jail 6 weeks prior. He had served 2 years of a 5-year sentence. Someone had spoken well of him to the judge. Someone always spoke well of men like Clement Foss to judges. Pauline read the letter twice, folded it with great precision, and put it in the bottom of her saddlebag under her extra shirt. Then she went back out to work because the water troughs needed filling, and the cattle did not care about her history. She carried the news of it for 4 days without telling anyone, and in those 4 days she became quieter in a way that Martha noticed and did not address directly, only showed in the extra biscuit she put on Pauline's plate, and the way she found reasons for them to work close to each other. Paco, with the sensitivity of a man who had lived long and observed much, brought her a sprig of wild desert flower one morning with absolutely no explanation, and left it on her windowsill. On the 5th day, Ira came out to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon, which was new. He usually came on Thursdays or Saturdays. He came around the side of the barn where Pauline was working on rehanging a gate that had come off its upper hinge, and he looked at her in that direct way he had and said, "Martha says you've been out of sorts this week. She's worried." "Martha worries about everything," Pauline said without stopping her work. "She worries because she cares," Ira said. "That's different from worrying about everything." He watched her work for a moment. "You've got the pin set too far to the left. It'll come off again in 2 weeks. Pauline looked at the gate, looked at the hinge, and moved the pin. She hated that he was right. He didn't offer to take over or ask if she wanted help. He just sat down on the nearby fence rail and waited in the way of someone who has nowhere more important to be. She worked for another 10 minutes in silence, and then she said without planning to, "I got a letter. There's a man who's been let out of jail who shouldn't have been." She said it to the gate, not to him. The silence behind her was very still. "Someone who hurt you?" Ira asked. His voice was completely level. Not the tight, hard level of a man pulling himself back from anger, but the real level, the kind that meant he was giving her all the room. She turned around. She looked at him sitting on the fence rail, his hands loose on his knees, his eyes on her face, and she made the decision not impulsively, not out of loneliness, but out of the deep, tired recognition that she had been carrying this alone for too long and that this man, this particular man, was asking without demanding. "Yes," she said. "Someone who hurt me." Ira nodded, a single slow nod. "Do you want to tell me about it?" he asked. "You don't have to, but if you want to, I'm here." She leaned against the barn wall and crossed her arms over her chest, not defensively, but in the way of someone gathering themselves, and she told him. Not everything all at once. It never comes out all at once when it has been held a long time, but the shape of it, the essential and terrible architecture of what she had survived. She had grown up in a small town in Kansas, outside of Abilene. Her father had died when she was 14, leaving her mother and 3 younger siblings with very little. She had married young, too young, 17, because it had seemed like the only way to provide for her family. A man named Clement Foss who had appeared respectable and had been anything but. For 6 years she had lived in that marriage, and what had happened in it was the kind of thing that did not have soft language. He had hurt her in most of the ways a man can hurt a woman, and he had done it with the patient, systematic thoroughness of a man who has decided that is his right. She had gotten out, finally, after 6 years, when she was 23. She had gotten out with nothing but the clothes she wore and a broken rib that had healed wrong. She had gone to Ruth, who had helped her, and then she had moved. She had kept moving for 3 years, not running. She was always careful to tell herself that she was moving forward, not away, working wherever she could find work, learning that she was capable of a great deal more than she had been allowed to discover in that house in Kansas. She had found that she was good with animals, competent with tools, willing to do hard work. She had found, slowly and unevenly, that there were decent people in the world. She had found that she could trust herself. She had not yet found that she could tell any of this to another person. She had not tried. Ruth knew the basic facts, and that was all. When she finished talking, she became aware that she had been speaking for a long time, and that Ira had not moved, had not shifted on the fence rail or changed his expression or offered any of the things people sometimes offered, the wincing sympathy, the horror that is really about them, the advice. He had just listened. He had looked at her through all of it with those green-brown eyes, steady and open, and he had not looked away. He had not looked away. She felt the sudden, unreasonable sting of tears, which she absolutely refused, and pressed her lips together. "Say something," she said, because the silence had reached the point where she needed to know what he was thinking. Ira was quiet for one more moment. Then he said, "I think you are one of the bravest people I have ever met, and I think what was done to you was a crime. And I'm sorry that the man who did it is walking around free." She stared at him. "That's it. What else would I say? Most people," she started and stopped. "Most people say the wrong things," he said. "I know what most people say. I've seen it enough." He paused. "Do you think he'll come looking for you?" The question was practical, not frightened. He was asking it as a man who was also a deputy and wanted to know the real shape of the problem. "I don't know," she said honestly. "He's the kind of man who might. He's the kind of man who can't stand not having control of something." Ira got down from the fence rail. He was taller than she remembered when he was standing close. He looked at her with the same directness he always had, but with something added to it, something that was not pity and was not protection in the condescending sense, but was more like a clear, determined solidarity, the look of a man who has drawn a line and knows exactly where it is. "You're safe here," he said. "Martha's property is not going to be a place where a man like that walks in and takes what he thinks belongs to him. I will make sure of that personally and legally." He paused. "But more than the practical part, thank you for telling me. I know that wasn't easy." She looked at him for a long moment. Her chest felt cracked open in a way that should have been frightening and was instead the closest to relief she had felt in 3 years. "I don't know why I told you," she said. "Maybe," he said quietly, "because you needed someone who wouldn't look away." She had no answer for that. She picked up her tools and went back to work on the gate, and he sat back on the fence rail. And after a while he started talking about the water rights dispute, and she asked questions about it, and they talked about that instead, easy and ordinary, as if the world had not just shifted on its axis. But it had. The rest of June passed in a new key, as if something that had been playing slightly flat had been tuned. Pauline did not feel suddenly unburdened or magically healed. She knew enough about how these things worked to know that was not how they worked, but she felt less alone, and that was enormous. That was a continent she had been crossing on foot and had just found a road. Ira came twice a week now, and nobody pretended it was only about Martha's ranch concerns. He brought news from town and sometimes books, because there was a lending library at the church, and he had noticed the way Pauline looked at Martha's small collection of novels with the hunger of someone who had not had much access to reading. He brought her a copy of a novel by Charles Dickens, and then was slightly flustered when she asked if it was his personal copy, and he had to admit that it was. "You can borrow it," he said, too casually, studying his coffee cup. "You trust me with it," she said. "I trust you with most things," he said, and then looked briefly like a man who has said more than he intended. And Martha, across the table, looked at the ceiling with great interest. Pauline read the book in 5 days, and they talked about it for 2 visits running. She had opinions, strong ones, delivered with the particular intensity of someone who has been thinking without an outlet for a while. And Ira leaned forward over the table with his elbows on the wood and argued back with equal conviction. And Martha sat in the corner and stitched a hem and smiled to herself in a way she thought she was hiding. In July, there was a matter with a runaway horse that had come up lame on the road outside the ranch, and Ira came to help and ended up staying the whole day, working alongside Paco and Pauline to get the animal settled and treated. It was a long, hot physical day, the kind that strips away any remaining pretense or performance because you are too tired for either, and by the evening all 4 of them, Ira, Paco, Pauline, and Martha, who had kept them in food and water all day, sat on the porch in absolute exhaustion and watched the stars come out. "I forgot the stars were this good out here," Ira said, leaning back in his chair with his eyes turned up. "You forgot?" Pauline asked. "I've been in town too long." "When you're in town, you stop looking up." She looked up too. The sky above New Mexico in high summer was enormous and absolute, so thick with stars that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental. She had slept under this sky more nights than she cared to count during the years of moving, and she had always been able to find some comfort in its indifference, in the fact that it was the same sky over Kansas and Texas and New Mexico and wherever else, that nothing she had survived had changed it at all. "My father used to name them for me," she said, without particularly meaning to. "The constellations, he knew them all." "Mine too," Ira said quietly. "He learned them in the war." Said the stars were the only thing that was the same on both sides of any battle line. She turned to look at him in the dark. He was still looking up, his face tipped to the sky, and there was something very young about his expression in that moment, something unguarded. "Which war?" she asked. "The war between the states. He fought for the Union. He didn't talk about it much, but he talked about the stars." They were quiet for a while. Paco had fallen asleep in his chair, and Martha was knitting with her eyes half closed, the clicking of needles slow and drowsy. "Ira," Pauline said, and it was the first time she had used his name to address him directly. She had always said Mr. Carson or just nothing, and the sound of it in her own voice surprised her. He turned to look at her. "Thank you," she said. "For the other week at the barn, for listening." He held her gaze in the starlight. "You don't have to thank me for that." "I want to," she said. "I'm not in the habit of it, I mean of letting people." She stopped. "This is not coming out correctly." "It's coming out fine," he said. "I don't let people in," she said directly. "I don't have much practice at it, and you," she pressed her lips together, "you make it feel less dangerous than it is." Something crossed his face, not triumph, not smugness, but something tender and careful. The look of a man who understands that he has been given something fragile and is holding it accordingly. "I'm not going to do anything with what you told me except keep it safe," he said. "That's all I've got to say about that." She nodded. Her heart was doing the thing again, the loud, inconvenient thing that she was going to have to address at some point. "And Pauline," he said. His voice was different now, lower and deliberate, the way it was when he was choosing words carefully. "I need you to know something, purely in the interest of honesty." "All right," she said. "I come out here because I like talking to Martha and checking on things," he said. "That part is true, but that stopped being the main reason about 3 weeks in." He paused. "I come out here to see you. I wanted you to know that plainly, without dressing it up, because you deserve to have things said plainly to you." The stars were very bright above them. The sleeping Paco made a small sound. Martha's knitting needles had gone very quiet. Pauline looked at Ira Carson in the dark and thought about all the reasons this was complicated, and all the reasons she was afraid, and all the things she had promised herself after Abilene. And then she thought about the way he had sat on that fence rail and not looked away. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." "And," he asked, "and I think you should give me a little more time," she said honestly. "Not because I don't, not because I'm not." She stopped and started again. "I need to trust slowly. I need to know that what I feel isn't just—" "You don't have to explain it," he said. "All the time you need." She let out a long breath. "You're very patient." Not always, he said. But for the things that matter, yes. Martha, in the corner, resumed her knitting with studied serenity. August in New Mexico was the color of bronze and the temperature of a Dutch oven, and it made everyone short-tempered and everyone grateful for every scrap of shade. Pauline tied her hair up and wore her oldest shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and worked through the heat with a focused grimness that Paco respected, and Martha openly admired. The water rights dispute that Ira had been managing reached a crisis point in the first week of August, when one of the ranchers, a man named Gus Halbert who had a face like a fist and twice, the temper pulled up a survey stake on his neighbor's property, and the neighbor, Clay Purvis, came to town with a shotgun to discuss the matter. Ira and Sheriff duly spent 3 days untangling it without anyone getting shot, which Ira described, when he came to the ranch afterward looking like a man who had just come through a different kind of battle, as a success, more or less. More or less, Pauline said, handing him a cup of water. Nobody's dead, he said. In situations involving Gus Halbert, that's a success. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. Martha was out in the garden. They were alone in the kitchen, and this had stopped feeling like something to be managed, and had started feeling like something to be appreciated. The two of them in a quiet room, the afternoon light making long rectangles across the floor. "You do this job well," she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. "What makes you say that? You care about it, not about the authority of it, not about the badge, about the actual people. You'd rather spend 3 days in a room with Gus Halbert talking about water rights than have someone get hurt." He turned his cup in his hands. "My father would have called that basic common sense." "Most men with a badge don't see it that way," she said. "Most men with a badge have figured out that the badge is the easy part," he said. "The people are what's hard." She looked at him. The afternoon light was doing something specific and unfair to the angles of his face, and she was fully, helplessly aware of it. "The letter I got," she said, shifting slightly, "about Clement Foss being released. I've been thinking about it. I don't think he knows where I am. I moved too many times and I was careful." She paused. "But I wanted to tell you that I've thought about it clearly, and I'm not afraid in the way I was before I told you. There's a difference between a danger you're carrying alone and one you've told someone about." "I've asked around, discreetly," Ira said. "Word from contacts in Dodge City is that he's in Kansas and seems to be staying there for now." "I'll keep asking." She stared at him. "You did that without me asking you to. You didn't have to ask me." Ira, his name in her mouth again, and this time without the careful hesitation, this time as a full and easy thing, as natural as breathing. "Thank you." "You're welcome," he said simply. They looked at each other across the table, and the thing between them was fully visible now, not unspoken but not yet fully spoken, patient and warm and building like the day toward evening. "I'm going to stop telling you to be patient," Pauline said. "Because I think what I actually mean is that I already, she stopped, and laughed, which surprised her, a small, unguarded laugh. "I'm not accustomed to saying these things." "Take your time," he said, and smiled, and it changed his face entirely, broke it open into something so warm and genuine that she felt it in her ribs. "I'm already very partial to you, Ira Carson," she said, which was the most restrained and honest version of what she meant. He was quiet for a moment with that smile still present, and then he said, "I am already very partial to you, Pauline Brenner. And I intend to keep being partial to you for as long as you'll let me." Martha came through the back door with a basket of tomatoes and looked at both of their faces and said, "Well, good." I was beginning to think I was going to have to say something, and set her basket on the counter with a thump of finality. September came in cool and golden, the hard summer heat breaking overnight in the way it did in that part of New Mexico, as if the season had simply decided it was done. The mornings were crisp now, with a thin frost on the grass by dawn that burned off by 9, and the light was different, lower and more amber, making everything look like something worth remembering. Pauline and Ira took their first ride together on a Sunday afternoon, nothing arranged or declared, just him arriving while Martha and Paco were occupied, and Pauline already saddling Gable with no particular plan, and him saying, "Mind if I ride out with you?" And her saying, "No," and meaning it. They rode east along the creek and then up onto the low mesa that overlooked the valley, and the world from up there was immense and rust-colored, and so beautiful it was almost uncomfortable. They stopped their horses at the edge and looked out at it. "My father used to say that the land doesn't care about your problems," Pauline said. "He meant it as comfort, I think. That the land just keeps going." "He sounds like he was a thoughtful man," Ira said. He was. He was also very tired by the time he died. 14 is a hard age to lose your father. "I was 19 when I lost mine," Ira said. "Heart all at once, no warning. I was still figuring out what kind of man I was going to be, and I no longer had the one person whose opinion of that mattered most to me." He paused. "I've been trying to be the answer to that question ever since, I think." She looked at him in profile against the wide sky. "How's it going?" He gave a wry, self-aware smile. "Reasonably well on a good day." She laughed again. It was happening more often now, the laughing, easy and unrehearsed, and every time it surprised her faintly, as if she was rediscovering that she was capable of it. They rode back slowly, and at the gate to the ranch he helped her down from Gable, and this was the first time he had touched her, his hands at her waist as she stepped down, and both of them were very still for a moment after, close enough for her to see the detail of his eyes in the afternoon light. "Pauline," he said. "Yes," she said, which was both an answer and something more. He kissed her gently, carefully, with one hand still at her waist and the other coming up to her jaw, not asking permission exactly, but offering it, in the particular way of a man who means to be honest about what he wants while making absolutely sure it is also what she wants. And it was. It was entirely what she wanted. When they stepped back from each other, she looked at him with her heart entirely unguarded, and her eyes full of something that was not, she realized, fear. "I should tell you something," she said. "Now, yes," she took a breath. "When I was in that marriage, one of the things that made it so, one of the ways it damaged me most, was that I stopped believing I deserved anything good. I stopped believing that someone could look at me and see a person worth knowing. I built something very hard around myself because of that." She met his eyes. "You have been chipping at that thing since the first week. I don't know if you know that." "I think," he said softly, "that you've been doing the chipping. I've just been standing here." She shook her head. "It's both. And I wanted you to know, I wanted to say it plainly, like you said things plainly, that I am not frightened of this. Of you. Of whatever this is becoming. And that is not a small thing for me." He brought her hand up and held it in both of his. "I know," he said, "and it is not a small thing to me either." They stood at the gate of Martha Delacroix's ranch in the September light, and the future felt, for the first time in a very long time, like something with good things in it. October arrived with its own news. The news was threefold and arrived within the same week, which was either the universe's sense of order or its sense of humor. The first was that Harlan Webb, in a long conversation with Ira, revealed that a man had come through town asking questions, a heavy-set man from Kansas, polite in the surface way of men who keep their real temper underneath, asking casually if anyone knew a woman named Pauline, traveling alone, brown hair, green eyes. Harlan had said he knew nobody by that description, and the man had moved on, heading east. The second was that Sheriff Dooley announced he was retiring in the new year, and that he intended to recommend Ira for the sheriff's position to the county commissioner. Ira had told Pauline this with the bashful, slightly bewildered look of a man who wanted something and was not yet fully prepared to admit it. "You want it," she said. "I think I can do the work well," he said carefully. "Ira, do you want it?" "Yes," he said, "I want it." "Then I think you should have it," she said, "because you'd be the kind of sheriff this town deserves." He looked at her with an expression that had gratitude in it, but was also something more personal, the look of a man who has had someone believe in him plainly and has felt it all the way down. The third piece of news was that Martha sat them both down one evening after supper, which in itself was a signal that something serious was coming, because Martha did not convene dinners for casual purposes. "I want to talk to you both about the ranch," she said. with her hands folded on the table and her eyes clear and direct. "I'm getting older. Tom's been gone 2 years and I've managed, but I've been thinking about what comes next. I'm not leaving the land, I'm not built for that. But I need more than I can manage alone, and I need to know that this place has people who love it like I do." She looked at Pauline. "You love this land, Pauline. I can see it in the way you work it. And you," she looked at Ira, "you've been half in love with this valley your whole time in Harding Creek." She paused. "I'm not going to interfere in anything that's not my business, but I want you both to know that this ranch has a future if you want it, whatever form that takes." Pauline and Ira looked at each other across the table. "Martha," Ira said slowly, I know, I'm an old woman who should mind her own affairs. But Tom always said that the most expensive thing you can do is wait for the right moment when the right moment is already sitting across the table from you." Martha stood up, picked up her coffee cup, and headed for the door. "I'll be on the porch. You two figure out what you're going to say to each other." She went out and closed the door. Ira and Pauline looked at each other in the lamplight. "She's not wrong," Pauline said. "No," Ira agreed, "she rarely is. About the moment being right. About that too." He was watching her carefully. "Are you?" "Yes," she said before he finished. "I haven't asked anything yet." "I know what you're going to ask." He tilted his head. "You know what I'm going to ask. You're going to ask me if I would be willing to consider, to think about." She stopped and squared her shoulders and looked at him directly. "You're going to ask me to marry you, and the answer is yes." The silence that followed was the full, reverberant kind, the kind that comes after something has been said that was true and large and final and has changed the shape of everything. Then Ira laughed, a full, genuine, disbelieving laugh with his head back and his eyes bright, and Pauline thought she had never seen anything so good in her whole life as that laugh. "I was going to ask you more gently," he said. "I didn't need it gently," she said. "I needed it honestly." "I love you," he said, and it came out very simply, not decorated, just the fact of it. "I love you, Pauline. I have since about the second time you handed me back my own opinion at this table." She came around the table and he stood and they held each other in the lamplight of Martha's kitchen, and outside the door they could hear Martha say to the night air, apparently to no one or possibly to Tom, "Well, it's about time." Ira asked Pauline properly, formally, a week later, down on one knee on the same mesa where they had taken their first ride, with the valley spread out below them in the October light and the sky enormous and blue above. He had a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small, dark garnet set in it, and he held it with both hands and asked her if she would do him the honor of being his wife, and he said it with his voice steady and his eyes very serious and very warm. She said yes again, and this time she was crying, and she was not embarrassed about it. He put the ring on her finger, and they stood at the edge of the mesa for a long time, and she thought about all the miles she had traveled, and all the hard years, and all the mornings she had woken up in unfamiliar rooms and told herself to keep going. She thought about the rope bed and the east window and the mother hen who let her be held, and Martha's laugh and Paco's quiet dignity and Harlan Webb who didn't ask questions. She thought about a man sitting on a fence rail and not looking away. She thought, "I made it here." The wedding was held on a Saturday in November, at the small church in Harding Creek that had finally received its coat of whitewash, because the Women's Sewing Circle had organized a painting party in October and gotten it done. Reverend Caldwell presided with evident pleasure. He was new to the circuit, energetic, and clearly delighted to have a wedding so early in his tenure. Martha stood with Pauline and Paco stood with Ira, which Paco accepted with great solemnity and then ruined slightly by crying during the vows, which made everyone love him. The whole town came. Harlan Webb arrived with a 3-layer cake. The fierce little fiddler from the summer's water pump celebration played with undiminished energy. Even Gus Halbert, the fence stake puller, was there, and he shook Ira's hand with genuine warmth and told Pauline she looked like spring, which was the nicest thing anyone had ever heard Gus Halbert say. Pauline wore a dress of deep blue cotton that Martha had helped her make over the previous 6 weeks, with small pearl buttons down the front and a skirt that moved when she walked. She wore her hair down, which she almost never did, and it fell to the middle of her back in a dark wave, and when Ira saw her walk down the aisle of that small whitewashed church, which was really just the aisle between 2 rows of pews, 10 feet at most, his face went through several things very quickly, landing finally on an expression of such uncomplicated joy that half the women in the church sighed audibly. She stood before him and took his hands and looked at his face, and she thought, this is the man who didn't look away. This is what it was all moving toward. The vows were traditional and she meant every word. The celebration afterward was loud and joyful and lasted until well past dark, and Harlan's cake was as good as promised, and the fiddler played until she had to be affectionately forcibly retired, and Ira danced with Pauline in the open square in front of the church under the November stars. Her first dance in longer than she could calculate, and he was not a graceful dancer, but he was enthusiastic and present, and she laughed the whole time. And the whole town watched them, and felt the particular good feeling of witnessing 2 people who deserve each other finding each other. They stayed that night at the ranch, in the room that had been Pauline's, which was now just their room until they sorted out the larger question of where to live, and Ira lay beside her in the dark and held her hand, and they talked quietly until well after midnight, about nothing and everything about the wedding, about Martha's toast which had been brief and perfect, about Paco crying, about what Ira's new responsibilities would look like when he officially took over from Sheriff Dooley in January, about the East pasture and whether they ought to think about increasing the herd in spring. And at some point in that quiet conversation in the dark of the room that had been the first safe place Pauline had lived in years, she said, I used to not be able to imagine this. A night like this one, talking like this. She paused. I want you to know that I know what it is, that I'm not taking it for granted. Ira turned on his side to face her in the dark. Neither am I, he said. Not one day of it. She found his face with her hand and held it and felt the realness of him, the solid warmth and reality of a man who had chosen her with full knowledge, who had heard every terrible thing and had stayed. Ira, she said. Pauline, he said. I love you, she said. In case I haven't said it enough, in case I've been, you've said it, he said gently. In every way there is to say something. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind in the east pasture and the distant low of cattle and the warmth of him beside her, and she did not dream of anything frightening, and that was its own kind of grace. January brought the new year and Ira's official appointment as sheriff of Harding Creek. The ceremony was brief and practical, a handshake from the county commissioner, a new badge, a formal filing of paperwork, but the feeling of it was large. He stood in the sheriff's office that he now occupied not as a deputy but as the man responsible, and Pauline stood beside him while the commissioner spoke, and she watched Ira's face and saw in it the quiet, purposeful pride of a man who has been given exactly the right work. They moved into the deputy's attached quarters, a small but adequate set of rooms behind the jail, proper 2 rooms and a kitchen, and Pauline made them good with the same focused practical energy she brought to everything. She got curtains from Martha, who insisted on contributing, and a rug from Harlan's store, and she arranged their small collection of possessions with care, including Ira's books, which took up an entire shelf, and which she added to with 4 volumes she bought at a bookseller in Santa Fe who passed through Harding Creek in February. Martha's ranch was still her second home. She rode out 3 times a week to help with the work and to visit, and Martha came into town on Saturdays for church and supper. Paco became a fixture at their table on Sunday afternoons. Their lives settled into the good, sustainable kind of routine that is actually a form of happiness, not a waiting for something more. In March, Pauline began to suspect that there was something more on the way anyway. She was certain by April, and she told Ira on an evening in April's first warm week, sitting on the steps of their small quarters with the spring air moving through the cottonwood tree at the corner of the building. She said it plainly because she said everything plainly now, had been reclaiming her directness steadily since the day on Martha's barn gate, reclaiming herself piece by piece. "I'm going to have a child," she said. "Your child. In the fall, I think." Ira sat very still for a moment, and then he put his arm around her and pulled her close to his side, and she could feel his heartbeat, fast and glad. "Are you well?" he asked first. Do you feel?" "I'm well," she said. "A little sick in the mornings, but nothing terrible. I'm strong." "You are the strongest person I know," he said, and his voice was rough with feeling. "Pauline, a child. It frightens me a little," she said honestly. "I'll tell you that plainly too. I worry about—" "You'll be a wonderful mother," he said. Not as a dismissal of her fear, but as a counter-truth, offered from the same place of honest conviction with which he said everything. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I don't know that yet." "I do," he said. "I've watched you with every person and animal on Martha's ranch, with every child in this town who's come to talk to you at the store or at church. You know how to make people feel safe. That is the whole of it." She thought about that. She thought about all the ways her own life had lacked safety, and how much she had therefore learned about its value, about the particular rarity and worth of a place where a person could be afraid without being destroyed for it. "We'll learn it together," she said. "Together," he agreed. Martha, when told, made the mulebray laugh and embraced Pauline so firmly that she had to ask to be let go for air, and then immediately began planning the quilt she was going to make for the baby, arguing with herself aloud about color choices, which was an entire entertainment. Paco removed his hat and held it to his chest and said, very quietly, "God is good," and that was all he needed to say. Harlan Webb said, "Finally some good news that isn't about water rights," and shook Ira's hand until it was sore. The summer passed in the full and busy way of a life well occupied. Ira's work as sheriff settled into the rhythms of a town that was not particularly lawless, but was particular. The disputes, the drunken Saturdays, the occasional traveler who needed to be discouraged from staying, the persistent small maintenance of a community's order that made real law work invisible but necessary. He was respected and, more importantly, trusted, because he treated every person who came to his office, regardless of who they were or what they had, as someone whose concern was legitimate until proven otherwise. Pauline helped Martha in the mornings and spent afternoons at home, and as her pregnancy advanced she read a great deal and had strong opinions about everything she read, and Ira would come home in the evenings to find her either deep in a book or deep in a fierce internal argument with it, which he found endlessly charming. They talked every evening over supper with the depth and ease of people who have given each other their full trust, and the stories came out gradually on both sides, more of hers, more of his, the shapes of their pasts revealing themselves slowly in the way things do when you have the safety to let them. She told him more about Abilene. He told her about Texas, about a thing that had happened to a friend of his there that had been the reason he left, a bad situation with a dishonest foreman and a ranch hand who had ended up dead, and Ira's testimony in court that had made him unwelcome enough to move on. He told her about the years between Texas and New Mexico, the drifting years, the ones he now recognized as years of becoming rather than years of waiting. She listened to him the way he had listened to her, fully, without judgment, without advice unless asked. "You had your own surviving to do," she said one evening. "Not like yours," he said. "Differently," she said, "which is not less. Nobody needs to have the worst story to have a real one." He looked at her across the table. "When did you get so wise?" "I was always this wise," she said. "I just used to keep it for myself." He laughed and she laughed, and the evening settled around them like something built to last. Their son was born on an October evening, with the lamp burning warm in the room and Martha and the town's doctor, a careful man named Holt, present for the work of it. It was a long labor and a hard one, and Ira spent much of it in the outer room pacing in the way of men who are helpless and know it. And Harlan Webb, who had come on no particular invitation but simply appeared, sat with him and talked about nothing and kept the coffee coming, which was the right thing to do. When the baby's first cry came through the door, Ira stopped mid-step and went entirely still. Dr. Holt opened the door. "A boy," he said. "Mother and child both healthy." Ira went in. Pauline was sitting up against the pillows with the baby in her arms, tired in the complete physical way of someone who has just done the hardest work there is. But her face was lit from within, open and overwhelmed and radiant in a way he had never seen on any face, would not forget as long as he lived. She looked up at him when he came in. "Come see him," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very small and very red, and had an expression of considerable indignation. He reached out and the baby's hand closed around his finger with the reflex grip of the newborn, unexpectedly strong, and something happened in Ira's chest that was beyond the reach of any language he had. "He's perfect," he said, which was inadequate but was true. "He is," Pauline agreed. She looked at Ira's face with the same attention she always gave him. "Are you all right?" "I am," he said. "I am very much more than all right." He looked at her. "Are you truly?" "Truly," she said. "I'm tired to my bones, and I am the happiest I have ever been." They named him Thomas James Carson Thomas for Martha's husband, because it was right, because this child had been made possible by Martha's ranch and Martha's kindness and a red barn with a weather vane, and James for Ira's father. Martha, when she heard the name, was speechless for the first and only time Pauline had ever witnessed, and then she gathered herself and said, "Well," very firmly, and looked at the ceiling, and when she looked back down her eyes were bright. Thomas was, from his first days, a loud and opinionated person, which Martha said was entirely predictable, and Ira took as a personal compliment. He had Pauline's dark hair and Ira's creekwater eyes, and he had an early and demanding relationship with the barn cats at Martha's ranch, which he began visiting as soon as he could be carried there, and which deepened into a formal alliance by the time he could walk. Life continued, and it was full. Ira was confirmed in the sheriff's position permanently the following spring, with support from the full community and the particular endorsement of the county commissioner, who said Harding Creek was the least troublesome county in his jurisdiction and credited Ira's approach to things. Ira accepted this modestly and then went home and told Pauline, who said, "I told you," and he said, "You did." And they celebrated with a good supper and the particular warm satisfaction of a life going exactly as it ought to. Martha's ranch was formally deeded to Pauline and Ira in a legal arrangement that Martha constructed with the help of the circuit judge, making them full partners in the property, with Martha retaining her rights for the rest of her life. "You'll run it into something good after I'm gone," Martha said in her direct way, "and I want to know it's settled." They did not argue with her. They had learned that arguing with Martha on practical matters was an exercise in futility. But Pauline held her hand for a long time afterward and said things with her eyes that she didn't have to say out loud. Paco remained at the ranch as he always had, steady and capable, and Ira found them a second hand in a young man named Aurelio who had come up from Chihuahua and needed work, and turned out to have a gift for horses that was almost supernatural. The ranch began to grow, carefully and responsibly, the cattle herd increasing and the fencing improving and a second barn going up the following spring, and the land responded to being well tended with the patient generosity that land has when it is respected. There was one more difficult thing to resolve, and it resolved in the spring of 1884, and then it was done. Word came to Ira through his contacts in Dodge City, a reliable network of sheriffs and deputies he had been cultivating since taking the position, that Clement Foss had been arrested again in Abilene, not for anything connected to Pauline, whose name had never been part of any public record in the matter, but for violence against another woman, and this time there was a witness, and this time the judge who heard the case was not the sympathetic kind. He received a sentence of 10 years, and the Kansas State Prison was not known for its leniency. Ira told Pauline on a Sunday afternoon while Thomas napped, and the spring air moved through the open window of their quarters. He told her plainly all of it and watched her face. She was quiet for a long moment. She looked out the window at the cottonwood tree, its new leaves moving in the light wind, and he watched the thing that moved across her face, complicated, layered, the specific mixture of relief and grief and old anger and the particular strange feeling of a chapter finally closing. 10 years, she said. At least, Ira said. She was quiet again. Then she said, the other woman, the witness, I hope she's safe. Of course that was what she said. Of course that was where her mind went. I made inquiries, Ira said. She's being cared for. The community there, some good people stepped up. Pauline nodded slowly. She turned from the window and looked at him, and something in her face was different, not immediately, not dramatically, but different in the permanent way of a weight that has been removed, the way a person holds their shoulders when they are no longer carrying something they have been carrying for a very long time. It's over, she said. It's over, he confirmed. She crossed the room and sat beside him on the bench by the window and leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. And they sat in the Sunday quiet while their son slept, and the cottonwood moved in the light, and the town of Harding Creek went about its Sabbath business outside. Ira, she said after a while, yes. Do you remember when I told you about him, at the barn, the first time? I remember every word, he said. I told you because I thought you wouldn't look away, she said. I wasn't certain, but I thought you might not. And, he said. She turned to look at him. This man with his green-brown eyes and his four-day jaw and his battered hat and his deputy-turned-sheriff's badge and his Dickens novels and his good heart. This man who had come through a door in a general store one afternoon in spring and looked at her eyes instead of her lip. This man who had sat on a fence rail and held still and listened. You didn't look away, she said. You never looked away. He held her closer. I never intend to, he said. The years that followed were the years that good lives are made of, the kind that have enough of both difficulty and joy to be real, the kind that build rather than diminish. Thomas grew into a child of enormous energy and questionable patience, who could name every star his grandmothers had ever pointed out, who could gentle a frightened colt by the time he was 5, and who had his mother's directness and his father's stubborn quiet, and was an entirely new person made of both of them and neither. When Thomas was 4, he got a sister, and they named her Me, and she came into the world with an opinion about it already formed, and proceeded to hold that opinion with considerable force for the rest of her childhood, which delighted Pauline beyond all expectation and frequently required Ira's mediating skills in their domestic rather than professional context. Martha lived to see both of them walking and talking and causing trouble in the chicken yard, and she loved them with the enormous, unrestrained love of a woman who has lost much and has found, late in her life, that love does not have a limit. She died in the summer of 1888, at 67, in the same house she had lived in for 30 years, and she died with Pauline holding one hand and Paco holding the other, and Ira sitting at the foot of the bed reading aloud from the Psalms, which Martha had asked for. The loss of her was real and large. Pauline grieved her the way you grieve someone who has been a mother to you when you most needed one, which is the specific grief that sits in the chest alongside gratitude. She planted a climbing rose at the gate of the ranch the following spring, the old red variety that Martha had always wanted and never gotten around to. And it took that first year and came back every spring after, reliable and vivid, and Pauline always greeted it in the morning on her way out to the first chores, and that was how she kept the conversation going. The Delacroix Ranch became the Carson Ranch in name and operation, and Pauline ran it with the confidence of a woman who has fully inhabited her own competence. She knew the land the way she knew her own hands, every slope and draw and weak spot in the fence line, every place where the water ran first, and every place where it left last in a drought. She hired fairly and paid fairly, and treated the people who worked the land with a straightforward respect that they returned without being asked. Ira served as sheriff of Harding Creek for 12 years, and in that time the town grew from a modest crossing on the creek to a genuine small town with 2 churches, a school, a proper doctor's office, and a stage line 3 times a week. He watched it grow with the particular pride of a man who helped build something and kept the peace around it. And when he finally handed the badge to his deputy, a young man from Colorado named Ash, whom Ira had trained himself and trusted completely. He did so without regret, and with the full intention of being a rancher and a husband and a father, which turned out to be work enough to fill every hour. Harlan Webb, who had introduced them without intending to and watched the entire story unfold with the satisfaction of a man who considers himself its architect, stayed behind his counter and knew everything that happened in Harding Creek, successfully, as he had always promised. He attended every Carson family birthday and holiday supper until he was 78 and too stiff to ride, at which point the Carson family came to him instead, and Pauline brought his supper on Sundays, and he told Thomas and me stories about the old days that were 60% true and 100% entertaining. Paco remained at the ranch until his own body told him it was time to stop, and he retired to his sister's house in town, and the Carson family visited him every Sunday, and Thomas took over his particular way of speaking to frightened horses, and me brought him flowers every week until the week he died at the age of 82, having witnessed more changes in the territory than he had ever expected, and having concluded that most of them were good. Aurelio became the ranch's foreman, and he married a woman named Constanza in 1889, and they had 4 children, and the oldest of them and Thomas Carson became the kind of friends that a small town produces, inseparable and loyal, and their friendship outlasted childhood entirely. There was an evening in the summer of 1890. Thomas was 8 and me was 6, and they were both asleep, their windows open to the warm night, when Pauline and Ira sat on the porch of the ranch house, which was bigger now, extended and improved over the years, though still recognizably Martha's house in its bones. They sat in the old chairs with the new evening wind coming off the mesa, and the stars above the valley were, as always, enormous and definitive. Ira was reading. Pauline had her mending in her hands but was not doing it, was instead looking out at the pasture where the horses moved in the dark, the shapes of them against the paler dark of the grass. She had Ira's mother's ring on her finger, the gold and garnet one, and she had worn it every day for 8 years, and it fit her exactly, and she never thought about taking it off. "What are you thinking about?" Ira asked, not looking up from his book. "Nothing specific," she said. "Everything." He turned a page. "Good everything or regular everything?" "Good," she said. "All good." He lowered his book and looked at her. He had a few more lines in his face now, the good kind, and his hair was going to gray at the temples in the way that suited him, and he was 38 years old and looked exactly like the man she loved, which was its own kind of miracle. "Tell me," he said. "I was thinking about the day I rode into Harding Creek," she said, "on Gable, with my Winchester and a split lip and about $12 to my name." She smiled at the porch rail. "I was thinking about how nothing I thought was going to happen happened, and everything I didn't know I needed found me." He was quiet, listening in the way he had always listened. "I was thinking about how far it is from that woman to this one," she said, "and how I used to think that kind of distance was impossible, that people didn't actually change or heal or get to have things like this." She gestured vaguely at the ranch, the sky, the children sleeping inside him. "I thought this was for other people." "What changed?" he asked, though he already knew. She could see that he knew. She looked at him. "You looked at me and you didn't look away," she said. "That changed everything." He set his book aside and reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, the one with his mother's ring on it, and held it in his. "You would have found your way here without me," he said. "You were already heading here." "Maybe," she said, but I wouldn't have known what to do with it when I arrived. I was so locked up in myself, so determined not to need anything. She tightened her fingers around his. You unlocked something, Ira. You were patient and honest, and you sat on that fence rail and you listened. And you unlocked something that had been shut for a very long time. He looked at her in the starlight, this woman who had ridden into his town with a rifle across her saddle, and more behind her eyes than most people carry in a lifetime, who had trusted him slowly and completely, and had opened into the fullness of herself with the unstoppable force of something that was always going to be extraordinary, given the chance. I love you, he said. I loved you from so early on that by the time I admitted it to myself, it was already the most settled fact in my life. She laughed softly. You hid it well. I thought I did, he said ruefully. Martha knew by the second supper. Martha knew before that, Pauline said. Martha knew when you came in for fence staples. He looked startled, then laughed his full laugh, the one that had broken her open the first time she heard it, and the sound of it went out into the night air and over the pasture and up toward those enormous, unalterable stars. Inside the house, Thomas and me slept the good deep sleep of children who have never had reason to fear the dark, and outside their parents sat in the summer night and held hands, and the ranch was quiet and real around them, the red barn with the running horse weather vane turning slowly in the wind, and Martha's climbing rose at the gate, and the pasture grass and the creek sound and the whole wide sky. Pauline Brenner had survived things that would break most men. She had survived them alone, in the hard and grinding years, with nothing but her own endurance and the stubborn insistence of her heart that she was worth more than what had been done to her. She had carried the weight of that survival across hundreds of miles and 3 years of motion, and 1 letter from Kansas, and a fence rail in the June heat. And then she had told Ira Carson. She had told him everything, the weight, the years, the architecture of the damage and the slow work of surviving it, and he had sat on that fence rail and looked at her face, and he had not looked away. Not that day, not the next. Not in 8 years of mornings and suppers and arguments about Dickens and hard labors and a son born in the lamplight, and a daughter born loud with opinions and a ranch that grew green from care. He had never looked away. And in that constancy, that patient and unhurried constancy, she had become herself. Not the person she had been before Clement Foss. She knew enough to know you cannot go back, only forward, but herself as she was now, made of everything that had happened and still standing, still capable of joy, still able to look at the stars and feel the bigness of the world as something generous rather than threatening. She was, she thought, exactly where she was supposed to be. Beside her, Ira read his book and held her hand, and the stars turned above them, and the wind came off the mesa, and the cattle moved in the dark of the pasture, and the climbing rose moved at the gate, and the world was quiet and full and good, and it was hers, theirs, and it would be for all the years that came after, of which there were many, and all of them were real, and all of them were worth the distance it had taken to arrive at them. The rose bloomed every spring without being asked. That was how Martha kept saying, "Well done." That was how everything was well.